Welcome to On Air, a podcast discussion at the intersection of artificial intelligence and international relations, where we will discuss the development of IR theory, law, and practice in the age of AI.
Welcome to the On Air podcast. I'm your host, Medlir, and I'm joined today by Dr. Joseph Vukov, an associate professor in the philosophy department at the Loyola University Chicago. He's also associate director of the Hank Center at the Catholic Intellectual Heritage at Loyola. The author of Navigating Faith and Science, as well as The Perils of Perfection, Vukov's research explores questions at the intersection of ethics, neuroscience, and philosophy of mind, and at the intersection of science and religion. Welcome to On Air, Joe.
Thanks, Medlir, for having me. I've been really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, this is great. And of course, our listeners, don't know, but we've been spending hours talking to each other. So these are the gems that now we're going to try and kind of get out of that conversation.
Exactly.
Let me start with a quote from your university website. An engaged learning course focused on emerging technologies that present existential challenges to humanity and how to tackle these problems from both philosophical and biological perspectives. This is how Loyola University Chicago, where you teach, describes the philosophy and biology for the future course, which you co-teach with Michael Burns. Now, this is very intriguing to me. I'm starting now a senior capstone on AI and international relations, international law, but it seems like this is even more interesting. I want to take this course. Can you tell us a little bit more about it, what motivates it, and also your work with Dr. Burns, who I understand is an associate professor in the biology department, not philosophy or religion?
That's right. Yeah. So Michael and I, we actually met at faculty orientation. So we entered Loyola together, and that's how we met each other.
Okay.
And we realized really quickly that we had a lot of interests in common, that we both are really interested in science and emerging technologies, but also interested in the ethics and philosophical implications of those emerging technologies. So obviously I'm coming from the humanities, ethics side of things. He's coming from the STEM side of things. We sort of meet in the middle where our interests overlap quite a bit. So we talked for quite a while about developing a course on these topics. And what we eventually landed on is the course that you just mentioned. It's called Philosophy and Biology for the Future. And if you're interested, listeners are interested, you can actually access the full course at scienceforhumans.com. So we've got a public-facing website. There's some of the materials are beyond a paywall, but you can kind of get a feeling for the basic structure of the course there. And what the course is we read science fiction novels or watch science fiction shows sometimes, and those are kind of the hook for the course. So we'll read one about some near future issue. So sort of a classic has been, we've read Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood several times, which if your listeners are familiar with that book at all, it details sort of some of the horrors and problems of genetic engineering in a very near future scenario. So it's based on the sorts of technologies we've developed with CRISPR-Cas9 and genetic engineering, and then depict some of the ethical and social questions that might come out of that. So we read the book, and then what we do is we step back, and Michael, being the biologist, can explain to them the science of the emerging technology. So he will explain to them, here's what CRISPR-Cas9 is, here's how it works. And then I will, right alongside him, we're teaching this course together, think through, what are the ethical questions that come out of this? What are the religious questions that come out of this? What are the social questions that come out of this? And our idea in constructing this course is that our students are the generation that are going to have to grapple with these questions. And we don't want them just trained in the ethical side of things, because these questions turn on the specifics of the technology. You can't sort of theorize in a vacuum when it comes to emerging tech. But on the flip side, we don't want people trained just in the tech without having these larger ethical, philosophical frameworks. So it really is this both at the same time kind of thing. So that's where the course started out, and that's the overall structure of the course. But what we've done in the last year or so is really pivot to focus a lot more on AI, as that's becoming an emerging issue that I know that you and your listeners think about, but that we've really kind of put front and center in the course. So now we're reading more science fiction of artificial intelligence, and there's dozens of titles you could pick from here. Read those science fiction novels or stories or shows. And then Michael and I kind of can walk our students through, here's the technical aspect of things, here's the ethical, social aspect of things. And then our students can see how those two interplay with each other rather than getting them in discrete courses.
That's fantastic. And you've given me a lot of ideas for my course now. I'm sure my students wouldn't mind if we switch to more fiction reading than actually
it's great. It's motivating and kind of gives, in philosophy, sometimes we talk about thick descriptions.
Right.
So sometimes scholars give thin descriptions where we have simplified scenarios or sort of simplified ethical black and white kind of scenarios.
Yeah.
And the nice thing about fiction is that it builds a whole world. It builds these fully human characters or fully AI characters, and sometimes, and asking these questions about what does it mean to be a human. And it kind of gives you this nice thick description that you can then build off of when you start adding the academic frameworks to that.
Yeah, no, certainly. I know that, I mean, I start with a couple of readings, but then we get into Space Odyssey 2001. And so we do a viewing of that, and then we'll discuss that over the course of the week, having read the book as well. But that's the nonfiction part. And then after that, we have to get into some of the other stuff. But I really like them. We'll put links to that website as well, so that people can go there and can find out more about it. Well, let's turn a little bit our attention, as you said, on AI. And of course, your description, you work on philosophy, but then this intersection of science, technology, and religion as well. You are in a Catholic university at Loyola. And so I want to have this conversation that perhaps I can't have with other guests in the program, which brings a little bit some of these questions on AI and conscience, and perhaps even this question of that you ask in an article, your co-author, again, Dr. Burns, does ChatGPT have a soul? Before I get to that, there is actually a quote from the article that you quote that we'll discuss, where you kind of think out loud about the trust that we can or not have with our students. And it says, how will our students resist our temptation to let ChatGPT finish their assignments, especially when faced with a mountain of homework and the prospect of another all-nighter at the library? We think these concerns are largely overblown. Can we trust our students more than this? You wrote this back in April. ChatGPT was kind of unleashed to the public in November, if I'm not mistaken. We're almost now a year away from that. Should we trust our students more on this? Have you, by experience, become more optimistic or less optimistic about the prospect of trust and student use of ChatGPT?
Yeah, I think I've stayed about the same as far as when it goes to trusting not only our students, but I think it's not just an issue of trust. So obviously you and I teach, and that's sort of our primary context in which we're working our day jobs when we're not talking about AI with colleagues and stuff. But I think the issue is larger than this. I think in the last year, there's been a lot of conversation about public trust and the potential for watermarking AI content, and all these kinds of conversations are basically, can we know when we're interacting with an AI? Can we tell AI generated content from non-AI generated content, and that sort of thing? And in one way, I think it is a sea change. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of content both in the classroom and outside the classroom that is being generated by AI now in a way that it wasn't, like you said, just a year ago since ChatGPT was released to the general public. But I think it's a sea change in the same way that the shift to something like Google was a sea change, not in every regard. But I remember when Google first launched, and just the internet generally, there was a lot of questions about now students are going to be able to just pilfer essays offline. And now students are going to be able to get all these sources that can't be trusted in the way they could be trusted when they were using the old card catalogs. That's how I grew up, is going rifling through the card catalogs. And what we found out eventually is that, did that change the nature of doing work, of doing research, of writing essays, of finding information? It absolutely did. But we eventually found our footing with the internet and figured out how to use it to be more productive, and how to, what appropriate and inappropriate uses are like. I think we're not there with AI yet, but I think that we'll see a similar evolution in that way, in that sort of there's some people in the higher ed world who are trying to, for instance, block ChatGPT on college campuses. I forget who did that, but there was some big university, and now I forget which one it was, but they basically are blocking it on their campus servers, which of course, anyone who's got access to cellular data, it seems like kind of a silly move. So that's the first part, is that the dam's broken. It's here. Students are going to be using it. So we need to think creatively about how to trust them in their use of that. In the same way, we need to learn how to trust each other in our use of it. And I think that that might seem naive, but I also think that it's absolutely necessary for us to make that step forward as educators. And I think that ultimately, if we proceed based on trust of each other and our students, obviously this isn't going to solve all the policy level problems that need to be addressed. But I think if we proceed on that kind of trust, at least in the classroom, we'll find ourselves pushed to engage in new kinds of pedagogy that are AI proof in their capacity to help our students learn. In the same way that when we teach now, I assume my students are going to be checking Wikipedia and checking Google for things and watching YouTube videos. I assume that while I'm building lessons and assignments. So I'm very clear, here's the appropriate use, here's the inappropriate use. But I'm then learning how to trust their engagement with that technology. Yeah. I think that's what that quote is pointing towards is, will we have to evolve as educators? Absolutely. Because it's too much to sort of ask for a boilerplate essay that ChatGPT can crank out a B+ version in 30 seconds.
Yeah.
But once we sort of get used to the fact that this is part of the technological landscape now, and we encounter students with trust, I think that we will evolve as educators, our students will evolve as students in such a way that, again, we sort of assume background internet usage by our students now. Yeah. Give it 5-10 years, we'll just assume AI usage, but we'll have pedagogical practices that assume that and build it in.
How do we do it? Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think there's a professor at Wharton that already has incorporated ChatGPT into writing assignments and actually has requirements in terms of how and when to use ChatGPT, and even a percentage of ChatGPT usage, so to speak, for a particular essay. I've kind of modeled one of my assignments in this course for fall 2023 for AI and IR along the lines of those assignments, meaning that we're going to spend a whole week on ChatGPT and kind of show the students what the pitfalls of using it, that and other similar kind of programs, but also the benefits of doing so, but also to how to use it in a way that you make use of synergies rather than...
Burns and I, we actually, in our class, this is pretty meta, but we actually ask our students to use ChatGPT to write an essay on the ethics of using AI for college work. That's the first part. Good. And then they submit that essay. But then what they also have to do is then they have to submit a 2-page reflection on the essay.
Yeah.
So part of the scaffolding work we've done is we've taught them the basics of how a large language model works, what AI bias is. We've sort of given some of them this language. Yeah. And they're able to really reflect on, oh, this wasn't really in my own voice, or there's this certain bias or skewing that actually isn't the way I wouldn't want to talk about this. Right. And then they're able to, we sort of try and get ahead of the curve where then they are able to not only understand the technology better, they're able to see what it can be used for, but then also for themselves articulate, here's what some of the limitations of this technology is.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That's the intention as well, is to point out the hallucinations and the fabrications that come with ChatGPT, but also that you have to find your voice. And ChatGPT certainly, unless it's trained on you, it's not going to do that. But also point out the fact, look, it's very easy to find, actually, even as a faculty, that when a student submits something like that, you'll know exactly that's not how the student writes. And so also to alert them to that. So I've told them I'll train you how to cheat on ChatGPT, but of course that's not the intention. But it's just to learn how to make use of them. Of course, there are faculty members that are not sensitive, and so I think we need to move forward cautiously, I think, on that. I think festina lente is what Clement VI, if I'm not mistaken, used to say, fast in a hurry, but slowly. And I think it's a great quote. Yeah,
because I think we can learn a lot from previous technological paradigm shifts. Again, I think obviously the shift to the internet and widespread internet usage is not the same as the shift to AI. Right. And we could talk about all the differences. I think there's some overlaps too. And I think we can think about what did good early adoption look like in a pedagogical ecosystem and what did bad early adoption look like. And I think there's some lessons to be learned there.
Excellent. Well, this actually gets us, the whole point, what you're saying, that there are some actually qualitative differences between what we experience right now, what we've experienced in the past. At least I believe that. I believe that AI, we are in an age of AI, and that implies that there are some radical changes and challenges and opportunities that AI offers to us. Now, in that same article, the title of your article implies there are more important questions than one we just discussed. At least if you are more spiritually or whatever minded, theologically minded, I guess, if you want to think that way. But the full title of the article is Does ChatGPT Have a Soul? A Conversation on Catholic Ethics and AI. So, question, does ChatGPT have a soul? Does it matter? And if so, how and why?
Good. So I think as someone with religious convictions and as someone who believes in something like the human soul, I think it's a helpful way to ask the question, does ChatGPT have a soul? If for some of your listeners, if that's not a helpful way of thinking, I think you could actually sub it out for, does ChatGPT have a mind? Is ChatGPT conscious? Are those equivalent? No, they're not. But I think that we can sort of treat them as similar ballpark questions.
Right.
Why do those matter? Because the ethical landscape changes depending how you answer that question. And this article is coming out of a conversation Dr. Burns and I had with Blake Lemoine, who you may have mentioned on this podcast before, or if not, going back about a year was kind of his moment in the headlines. He was a Google engineer working on the Lambda project, sort of went public with this claim that he thinks that that model is conscious or sentient, I think was his word.
Right.
And eventually there's a little saga that unfolds, and eventually he gets canned from Google, but continues to kind of be in the public consciousness. You'll see interviews popping up with him once in a while. And our interview was with him about that claim. And I think Blake exactly correctly saw that those are important questions for us to ask, because if ChatGPT or a similar model, obviously there's important differences between the Lambda project and ChatGPT. It's not just a large language model. There's some other modules built into it. If we answer those questions in the affirmative, that there's a mind, that there's a soul, that there's consciousness, that there's sentience, all of a sudden our ethical landscape changes in a really important way. You might start thinking about, are there obligations we have that it has? Are there something like rights involved? Do those rights look very different than human rights? People will sometimes talk about non-human animal rights. Maybe that makes sense. Maybe that doesn't make sense. But these sorts of questions start to get into the water depending how you answer that question.
Right.
How do I answer it? I answer it no, because I think that the difference, I think there's two different ways one can understand the soul or the mind or consciousness. On the one hand is a distinctively modern understanding, which says that the soul, mind, consciousness is something completely immaterial that can then be in principle put in all kinds of different kinds of bodies. So it can be, the human soul can be in us, but it can also exist somewhere else. And it's sort of this almost like ghost idea of what the human person is. And that stands opposed to a more ancient way of understanding the human soul. Well, arguably more ancient. We could at least say more Aristotelian way of understanding the human soul. And that way of understanding the human soul is the one I subscribe to, which says that the soul is essentially embodied in a certain kind of body. And again, if that language is distracting to your listeners, there's a whole tradition of thinking that the mind is embodied, or sentience is embodied, or consciousness is embodied.
This moves away from the Cartesian kind of dualism.
It does.
Mind-body kind of thing. And what you're saying is that they're actually, you can't understand one without the other. The two of them are actually infused. And that's what is, I guess, a conscient being is. It's not, you can't separate consciousness from the embodied being itself.
Exactly. And just a couple of sort of simple examples. I won't give you there's been centuries of debate between, in a way it goes all the way back to the debate between Plato and Plato's student Aristotle. And Plato had much more this disembodied view of the human person, and Aristotle had a much more embodied view. So this is not just a modern thing. It's an ancient disagreement as well. A motivator for thinking about this embodied view of the soul would be, if you're a musician, or if you're a dancer, or if you're an athlete, you can think about the way you're conscious or sentient of your surroundings in those contexts. It's not that you're all upstairs thinking through how to run an arpeggio, or how to go in for a layup, or how to dance in a certain way. You're rather thinking through those things with your body. And that's the sort of example that's going to be motivated for someone who thinks that the soul or consciousness is something that's embodied in a certain way. And if the soul is embodied, then that definitely changes the tenor of the discussion about what exactly the nature of something like a really sophisticated AI, or if we ever make it to general AI, what that would be when you got embodiment in the background.
Yeah, I was reading a book actually on just this, and the sense is that consciousness is kind of the end result of an evolutionary process where we start with the feeling and touching, and then eventually that kind of sense of awareness of the surroundings and everything else leads to the development of consciousness. And so in neuroscience, there seems to be, right, a lot of the research is going in that direction, meaning, right, that embodiment and consciousness are kind of like go hand in hand. You can't have one or the other. But that's the synergy to those two. There are attempts.
And it's sort of the disembodiment thesis too. There's a strong tradition in philosophy of mind right now called functionalism or machine functionalism, which basically takes its cues from the Turing test. There's some maybe subtleties there, but the functionalist theory of mind says any two systems that are functionally identical, so correlates inputs and outputs in roughly the same way, are psychologically identical. And that's sort of the new Platonism, because it's a very disembodied way, right? It's literally the sort of cute tagline for the functionalist is matter doesn't matter. All that matters is functional identity. Right. So if that's what you think, and I think that's clearly what Blake Lemoine is channeling in some of his claims that he thinks that some of these models are sentient, is it sure seems functionally identical to a human being. And if you're a strong functionalist, matter doesn't matter. Right. All that matters is that inputs and outputs are correlated in the right ways.
Yeah. My sense, though, is that a lot of research on AI now and consciousness is moving the direction that you were hinting at, in the sense that the way we were thinking about AI and consciousness up to this point, the functionalist kind of way of thinking of it, is very limiting. And we're never really going to get to consciousness because, as you point out, you just cannot separate one from the other. And so now there are attempts at trying to raise and to grow up a conscious AI. So instead of just having a fully grown up or mature adult, so to speak, AI system, you actually slowly raise it as you would raise a child. So that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum now, I think a couple of days ago, there was an article about how Boston Dynamics and I think ChatGPT, if I'm not mistaken, are cooperating now, where one is providing, in a way, the mind and the other body. But your comment implied that experiment is unlikely to succeed, at least not in the way that we're thinking about in terms of consciousness.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's a really interesting response to the line I was just running about how to have something conscious or to have a mind or to have a soul. Again, not equivalent terms, but for our purposes, we can kind of treat them as similar. Well, you might say, okay, Joe, you think you need a body for all that. Let's just get Boston Dynamics on board, throw it in a really cool robot, and there's your body right there.
All right.
I think that's a step in the right direction insofar as it's sort of acknowledging that consciousness and mind can't be just free floating, that there are these embodied aspects of consciousness. But yeah, I mean, you're right to conclude that, or to think that I'm going to say that's not quite enough there, because I think that you're still sort of missing the boat on, you're kind of adding things in after the fact to try and make up for lost ground, when in fact, what consciousness is from the beginning is something biological, and it's something organic, and it's something that, like you said, is communitarian. And there's so many parts of the picture that I think that it's difficult to just keep adding on to it and getting consciousness. Dave Chalmers is a famous philosopher, but a philosopher who pretty incredibly is not only known by philosophers. So he's at the NYU Center for Neuroscience too. So he's known among scientists. And I think he actually has a fairly strong computer programming background too. I forget exactly his background, but he definitely dabbles in a lot of different disciplines. And he initially identified the sort of thing I'm talking about as the hard problems of consciousness. And according to Chalmers, solving some of these functional equivalencies as far as different processes that humans carry out is what he calls easy problems of consciousness. Not that they're easy to solve, but they're easy in that they can in principle be given a functional description, or that they can be realized by robotics or something like that, where he thinks that you never quite can get to, and here's why the lights go on upstairs. That's what he calls the hard problem of consciousness, which he thinks you can't solve by merely adding more things into the mix, basically.
So just think about this. For people that are familiar, at least, with the religious thought or the story of Genesis, it seems that what ChatGPT and Boston Dynamics are doing is just reinterpreting or revisiting what supposedly, right, at least a Judeo-Christian kind of scriptural text implied it happened. That is, that there is this body made of clay and there is this soul or spirit or something that is breathed into this body, and voila, you have life. And so it's not ironic, but it's perhaps a little bit, it's provoking to think that from your perspective at least, you would think, well, no, that narrative is still fine. Of course, I'm simplifying the narrative. I know that the understanding interpretation of that narrative is quite complex, but at least for somebody who's uninitiated, they look at those two events and they're saying that sounds about the same. Why is it that it works for scriptural text but does not work for more scientific endeavors, besides the obvious answers, of course?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think part of it has to do with, at least from a Catholic perspective, how we would understand God's role as creator and our role as, you could call us, sub-creators or something like that. So part of what humans do is we create things, but we create them differently in the way that God creates them. And at least from a Catholic perspective, it's only God that is capable of creating the human soul. So this is an explicit Catholic teaching that we're actually, in the Catholic tradition, we're okay with humans coming about through evolution and by natural selection. But we also believe that God created the human soul directly. So there's this sort of special act of creation of God, of the human soul. What that looks like exactly, how that meshes with evolutionary accounts, those are interesting questions that we could talk about, but maybe a tangent here. But yeah, I think that's one big difference, is that humans are not divine in that regard. We may be capable of creation.
We're not gods. Is that what we're saying, Joe?
Not gods. Well, it's interesting here because we talk about
the God complex, I imagine.
Yeah,
so.
It's interesting because we talk about the image of God and being created in the image of God. And some scholars have thought, well, part of the image of God is that we create things. Unlike other organisms, we have this creativity that's somehow a reflection of God's creativity. But it's by analogy. It's not the same thing. So I think that's one big difference. And I think another big difference is that, I'm not going to articulate this maybe as clearly as I'd want to, but it seems like the sort of combining a large language model with a robot is more of a Frankensteining kind of creation, where we're mashing together parts in a way that doesn't add up to a whole, in the way that the creation in Genesis, where God takes the dust of the ground and breathes life into it, is supposed to be creation of this whole. And this is where I think, that whole tradition of sort of coming out of Frankenstein and these cautionary tales about playing God, it's an interesting tagline, because I think there's some theoretical work to be done with by what that means. What I would want to put my finger on is not so much overstepping our boundaries in research. I don't think that anyone's overstepping boundaries in research when we try to tie robots to AI. I think that's a pretty cool project, and in fact, a good project to pursue. But I think that what the sort of the Frankenstein line points at is that we're doing something different than when we are created by God in God's image in the way that Genesis is trying to communicate.
Yeah, no, I understand. That's fair. Now, here at On Air, our patron saint is Saint Diogenes.
I noticed that. Yeah.
So we'd like to be cynical about both developments in tech and elsewhere, and some may question the role of religious organizations and religious discourse in discussions regarding technology, ethics, and governance. What do you say to that?
I think one thing to say is that there's a understanding of freedom of religion. Maybe this is a specific American context in which I'm going to talk out of. But this idea that freedom of religion means something like you're free to go off by yourself and pray quietly in the way that you see fit. And certainly that's part of what freedom of religion entails. But I take it that part of freedom of religion means bringing religious identity and practices and beliefs into the public sphere as well. As a religious person, I'm not Catholic for 1 hour a week when I go to mass and for 20 minutes a day while I'm praying. I'm Catholic all the time. And it's something I aspire to. So I'm probably not there yet, but that's my aspiration, is that this is the sort of human being I want to be. So this is, I think, the first argument that's maybe not going to be all that satisfying to someone who doesn't have a religious background, but I think it's part of bringing ourselves as religious people who are religious people. It's only natural to bring that into the public sphere. And I think it's part of what freedom of religion is getting at. Again, not just this freedom to pray, but freedom to be religious in the public sphere and to give and take religious reasons in the public sphere. So that's maybe the more, I don't know. I'd be interested in your thoughts on some of that too. I'm not a political scientist or a political philosopher, but that's sort of that from a political theory end of things, I would say that. The other thing I would say is that religious communities and religious groups have a long history of thinking through ethical questions, of thinking through the big questions, of thinking through social questions. And it would be a missed opportunity for society at large not to listen to what those groups have to say. I think this goes not just for my own tradition. I'm coming from a Catholic background, but there's all these other traditions around too that they've spent a lot of time thinking through what it means to be human, what it means to be a good human. And I think making a space for those discussions in the public sphere is crucial, if nothing else, because of the long history and traditions that those folks are speaking out of. Those need to be heard as well. That's not to the exclusion of secular perspectives. Those need to be heard too. But I think we have a wealth of tradition and resources, and it would be a shame not to hear what those tradition and resources have to say about these new developments. Yeah, no, absolutely. And you preface by saying that's a very American perspective. I think you're absolutely right. One would argue that my question is very Western centric, so to speak, in the sense that in the West, we have a more postmodern kind of view of religion and religious discourse in the public life. But of course, for most of the global South, religious discourse and religious affiliation is still an important element of their identity. And increasingly, this technology is going to have an impact on their lives. And so it's important here to understand from a Western perspective, again, that yes, there is some skepticism here in the West, but generally, globally speaking, this is perhaps not such an obvious question after all. And I think it's important for us to be reminded of that. Sometimes we think too much, right, in terms of Western perspectives. Yeah, and I think too, there's this tendency, like you said, in the West, and maybe especially in academic spaces, to put things in purely secular terms. I also do work in biomedical ethics, and academic biomedical ethics tends to be phrased in very secular ways. But there's this disconnect because people, and this includes people in the West, when it comes to end-of-life decision-making, when it comes to healthcare decisions, often think about those decisions in explicitly religious terminology. So I think that's another reason why, kind of pivoting back to AI, why there needs to be religious organizations involved, is to mitigate that disconnect when it comes to actual people thinking through how they should behave. There's a big chunk of people out there who their initial framework they're going to is a religious one. Right. And there's going to be this big disconnect if you see these conversations going on in purely secular terms, when you think, well, that's not how I experience this or what my questions are. So I think rhetorically, and for the sake of meeting people where they are, aside from everything else I said, is a really important reason why religious organizations need to be involved as well. That's where a lot of, maybe the majority of people are at in their questions about this. Yeah, and I think that there, on this question, doesn't seem to be just a supply side kind of discussion here. I mean, it's not that it's just the religious organizations that are actually volunteering participation. I think I was reading a report where pointing out that people actually that are behind the chatbots, I'm quoting here, are actually asking questions of priests and ethicists rather than turning to their artificial intelligence creations
They want to know what is consciousness, what is the nature of humanity, what is the purpose of life, which is kind of like what we were discussing here today. And that those are questions that, of course, we can address through different means. And of course, religious perspective is one of those. Of course, my work in the past, not so much nowadays when I'm working on an AI, but has been on the role of non-government organizations or transnational advocacy networks. And we know that across various issues, including international criminal law, which was one of my areas of research, obviously religious organizations have a lot to say, and they are quite engaged, both at the international negotiation tables, but also at advocacy level. On this front, I think it's important to just point out here, just in passing, that the Vatican itself has also partnered with, I think, Santa Clara's University. I think it's called the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics, and they formed the Institute for Technology, Ethics, and Culture. I have one last question for you, but maybe do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I think that that document is a really good example of what it can look like when religious organizations get involved in these kinds of questions, right? So you might think, oh, the Vatican has a new document on AI. It's going to be highly theological, highly abstract, and highly inapplicable to anyone who isn't a Roman Catholic.
Right.
Couldn't be farther from the truth. The document they ultimately produced is a very on-the-ground, fine-grained way of thinking about what human-centered AI might look like. And it covers, again, it's very, very practical. It covers things from hiring practices to training to sort of considerations when building a new model that are very practically oriented, situated in a framework that's Catholic, yes, and that's human-centered, yes, but also, I think, a very important contribution to the conversation about what it might look like to develop AI in a human-centered kind of way that are going to be applicable way beyond just the Catholic circles that ultimately produced it.
Yeah, no, totally. So let me then finish with this one question. We'll turn the table around on the impact of AI on religion. You have a book, came out in 2023, Perils of Perfection, Enhancement. So it's a guide, as you pointed, for navigating the perils of perfection while embracing the fullness of human dignity. Giving you a chance to comment about your book a little bit, but also maybe comment on kind of the follow-up question. That is, how do you see AI impacting religion, religious practice, but also kind of like the way we think of ourselves as what is to be a human?
Yeah. So in the book, my initial reaction to a lot of human enhancement technologies. So the book is largely a response to the transhumanist movement, who your listeners might know are very into life extension and genetic modification and sort of all these technologies to transcend our humanity.
I would say pseudoscience and pseudo-religious. Would that be not too kind a way of describing transhumanism?
Yeah, I think so. There's definitely, maybe we could call it quasi-religious, quasi-science.
Okay, that's good. That's better. It's a positive spin. I like that.
Yeah, then the transhumanists might be okay with that too.
Yeah, I think
but my knee-jerk reaction as a religious person and as maybe just a philosopher generally, I'm kind of cynical about that. And I don't think that those are necessarily goals that we should be aiming for in humanity. So a big part of that book is kind of working through, here's why what gets labeled as human enhancement might not actually be enhancing when we really understand who we are as humans. But on the flip side, I like technology. I love working with AI. We're on a Zoom call right now. I mean, I use an iPhone. So trying to navigate both for myself and for my readers, how can we keep our eyes centered on what humanity is, what really matters about humanity, but at the same time, not being total Luddites about it and embracing the good parts. I think the same goes for your follow-up question when it comes to the effect of AI on religion or how religious folks should be taking up AI. I think it's not a paradigm shift. So I don't think that it is going to change the way we understand ourselves as human beings or even how we should act in the world. Instead, what I really think it is, and I'm working on a follow-up book in many ways to Perils of Perfection on these questions exactly. I think it's an opportunity for us to reflect on who we are as human beings, because I think that it raises old questions in new ways. It raises questions about consciousness, about ethical action, all these things. So I think it raises those questions in new ways and kind of lets us relook at what we already believe to be important about our humanity and to be important about ethical action and to be what it is that makes us truly ourselves. So I really do see it as an opportunity in several ways, an opportunity for reflection, but also once we've done that reflection, an opportunity to take it up and use in creative ways, in ways that make sense within those ethical and religious contexts.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, and we come back to Diogenes, of course, the inspiration, at least for the philosophical kind of questions that we try to address here. In our pilot, I discuss his quest for finding a human or an honest human. But the way I see it, at least, when he's walking through the streets through the Agora of Athens with his lamp in daylight, saying "Anthroposiko," right? I'm looking for the human, and of course, translated in different ways. But the meaning of it, at least the way I take it, is what is about us that is human, right? That if you stripped everything down to the bare essentials, say, okay, here it is, here's found it. And I'm not sure that we're anywhere close to that, but hopefully this conversation today has provided us a little context for that. So, Joe, thank you so much. I appreciate you answering these questions, not always easy ones.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Medlir. This was a great conversation.
No, it's great. And of course, thank you to all our listeners. We really appreciate your comments and feedback, so please keep it coming. As always, if you like the show, we invite you to subscribe and leave us a comment. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to join us for the next episode for a discussion at the intersection of AI and IR, theory, law, and practice. Until then, stay human.